Well, thank you for being back. And in the first session, we kind of had a focus, I think, on a different way in which we can relate, the kind of metaphors we think of when we relate to God. And some very good questions was asked afterwards. And this evening, what I would love to focus on is those kind of different ways in which we can think of relationship to the divine. What implications do they have for how we understand who and what God is? Because we had one question about that scripture that says He's the same yesterday, today and forever. How does that work with a God that is dynamic in relationship? Relationship is movement. Movement is change. So all of those kind of concepts can seem contradictory. And I want to tackle some of those, but all the while, why we tackle those ideas is because we want this word to become flesh. We want this to be tangible reality. We're not just playing with ideas for the sake of playing with ideas. Ultimately, the word becomes flesh. Ultimately, the destination of God's thought is not a book. It's not an idea. It's not a concept. It's not the Bible. It is actual material existence. The word became flesh. And so what the gospel communicates wants to find embodiment. It wants to influence the way in which you enjoy life, the way in which you enjoy others, the way in which you enjoy God. So why don't you right now just speak to the Spirit of truth and say, just invite God's Spirit to unveil Himself to you, to take you beyond the concepts and the ideas and to reveal Himself. Thank you, Holy Spirit. Thank you that the power of the declaration of this gospel is far more than just concepts and words, but that you come, Lord, and you unveil yourself. I pray that you would just take the veil off our understanding, off our consciousness, that we might behold you, that we might see what you see, that we might be transformed by this love. Thank you, Lord. Amen. So I'm going to start off with that question that was asked, because we spoke about how dynamic, transformative this relationship with God is, that maybe everything is not planned or determined, but rather that God extends extravagant freedom towards us and say, you co-create who and what you are. You co-author your life story. You are enabled to participate. Your decisions really matter. What does that say about God? Now, that scripture is the same yesterday, today, and forever. We take those thoughts and we just neatly fit them into our categories of understanding. And one of the philosophies that has influenced our understanding of time and eternity, mostly in the Western world, is more of a Platonic philosophy. And even lately, there are theories that understands time as something, they call it the block time theory. That time is something that actually exists already, the future and the past already exist, and we kind of just pass through it. Plato's idea was more that there's a heavenly realm, and this material realm is a shadow of what's in the heavenly realm. So every every chair, I thought I had a wooden chair, every chair basically has the perfect copy in this heavenly realm, and all these chairs are just copies of that heavenly chair and derive the essence from it. Now that philosophy has got beautiful ideas in it, but we have moved away from those ideas philosophically. Now, to come back to time, because if we speak about change, we speak about time, we speak about how do we understand eternity and time. Because in that block view of time, the time is something that really exists. What we've imagined in our theology is God is outside of time. Have you ever heard that?
Yes.
That concept? That for God, He can look at the past, the present, and the future, and it is all present to Him. So there's a few implications with that. One of the implications is that for God, nothing new ever happens, because He stands outside of time, and the future, the present, and the past, they are all just present to Him. So for God, have you heard that? For God's never surprised. Nothing new ever happens to Him. Now, if you go look in the Oxford Dictionary for the description, nothing new ever happens, that's the definition of boring. And so to a large extent, we've imagined and we've created the omni-boring God. The God that couldn't be more bored if He tried, because everything's present to Him. Nothing surprises Him. He sees everything in detail from beginning to end. Now, what that means relationally is also, it also has implications, because, you know, in real life, I encounter things that deeply affects me, and the way in which I'm affected then also changes the relationship we have with others. There's times when we can just have a nice, joyful, surface kind of conversation and just enjoy the day, and there's other times where something happens that I know deeply affects her, and I can't relate with Mary Ann on the same superficial level in those moments as I do in other moments. Relationship is a dynamic thing. But imagine me being able to step outside of time, and I can see everything that she experiences from beginning to end. And so I am constantly just the same. And whether she's had the experience of great joy or deep pain or confusion, I'm just the same. That's a very strange kind of relationship, because we understand relationship as something that affects both parties. It doesn't just affect one party. And so with all these concepts that we deal with, one of the ideas, the immutability of God, is a doctrine that focuses in on this changeless nature of God. And again, there's aspects, just like there's aspects of the plan that's good, there's aspects of certainty that's good, there's an aspect that we'll get to of God's unchangeableness that's good. But again, we always seem to press these metaphors to a level where they just become theory and totally weird, because real relationship, love, is something that impacts us. And we've pressed the metaphor of God's unchangeability to the extent that we didn't really understand His love, because if He's truly changeless in every aspect, it means that I don't really affect Him. But any of you who have loved deeply knows that love transforms you. Love transforms you. That's just the nature of love. Love is not just something you dish out casually without it affecting you. If you truly love, it is something that immediately begins to work, not on the person you love only, but it begins to work on you. Wow. Their pain becomes your pain.
That's right.
Their joy becomes your joy. You are affected by those you love. I love Robert Capon, or however you pronounce his Capon.
Capon.
Capon, okay. I'm sure it's Capon, but
It's fine. I'm not certain.
I love his commentary on the one chapter, and it was just as we started, we had like a 6-7 year stint of constantly traveling to groups like this, being with a different group every 3 or 4 days, having no home to go back to. And during that period, I read his little comment on Jesus's words where he said, those who have left parents and lands and friends and whatever for the sake of the gospel will find 100-fold in this life, friends and parents and land, possessions, etc. And his comment on that was, what he did not say is that psychologists have told us that most of our problems are because of our possessions, our parents, and our friends. So it's not just a 100-fold return it's actually 100-fold. And why it was so relevant for me is because we suddenly found our usual normal circle of friends expanded to meeting a few hundred people every week, and people that we really connected with and got involved in, not all hundreds, but at least, once a week, there would be a real beautiful connection with a new friend, a new couple. And we suddenly realized that having 100 times more friends also means there's 100 times more trauma, 100 times more difficulty, 100 times more joy, but 100 times more everything. So it increases all of those aspects. I don't know how I got onto that story. But let's get back to, this is how I got there. Love is something that affects us. And very often we have pushed the idea of God's immutability or unchangeableness to the extent that his love just became a mysterious philosophical idea. If Jesus showed us anything, it's a God who is present in human life, who can be affected by other humans, one who weeps, one who feels, one who suffers with us, somebody that's deeply involved in our lives. So instead of the omniboring God who stands outside of time, what we need to do to maybe have a different perception of who God is also reconsider what is time and what is eternity. Because in the Platonic philosophy of time and eternity, they were basically opposites. Eternity was the opposite of time. In time, things change, therefore in eternity, they stay the same. In time, things move, therefore in eternity, they're stable. And so in that Platonic view of time and eternity, they were extreme opposites. Time was everything, eternity is not, and vice versa. And so when that is the philosophical category with which we view our world, then the idea of I'm the same yesterday, today and forever, God is eternity, that has a specific meaning. But now let's rethink what time is. does time really exist? And what is the nature of time? Today we're in a world where we are driven by appointments and time more than ever before. Time is money, is productivity. And we work according to that clock, but what is the clock? Because you can't go out into this world, into this universe, and there's nowhere in this universe where you'll find a substance called an hour or a day. The clock basically measures movement. Now, 24 hours is how long it takes for our Earth to spin upon its axis. A year is how long it takes for our Earth to spin around our Sun. And so I'm going to look at time from a few perspectives. So this is one perspective, that time in one sense is simply a measurement of movement. We measure the movement of our Earth, we measure, and according to those measurements we can then divide up our days, etc. But is that all that time is? Simply a measurement of movement, or is there something more real about time? Now, Einstein made the most amazing declarations about time and space, which I'm still trying to get to grips with fully understanding it, but for a long time I knew I didn't understand it. Now I think I'm understanding a little bit of the, giving my attention and trying to study it and know what he said. But I think one of the most fundamental things that Einstein confirmed in his theories is that time and space, although they're one thing, and we'll get to why they are actually one thing. That's why he calls it space-time or time-space. They are intermingled in a way that will become clear later. But one of the things that was revolutionary in what he said is that time is indeed real, but it is not one thing. Now, how do I say that? So, for instance, he said a person living at a high altitude on the top of a mountain will age quicker than a person living at sea level. When they meet after a few years, the person that was living at the top of the mountain will have had more time to think, will have lived longer than the person at sea level. Now, it's actually only fractions of seconds, but if that boggles your mind, because you might think, how can a person living for 5 years at the top of the mountain have more time than a person living for 5 years at sea level? When they meet, how can the one have had more time? Well, simply because our measurement of 5 years is not the most accurate measurement of time. There are other relationships, for instance, gravity in this instance, that also affects time. Now, this is no longer a theory, it's actually been proven. They've taken atomic clocks, and depending on speed and altitude and relationship to gravity, a clock traveling at a higher speed, at a higher altitude, they bring them back together after a while, and the one is different from the other. Time works differently. Now, why this is significant is simply because time is not one thing. In the same way as music is not one thing. We don't just experience music in general, we experience a specific melody. No, a melody it's part of music, but it is one instantiation, one example, one manifestation of something that we generalize and call music. But no one's ever heard music as a whole. We've only heard melodies and songs and etc. And in the same way, time isn't one thing. This for me was the most profound understanding that came out of Einstein's thinking is all of time is relational. And therefore your time is as unique as your presence. Your presence is your time. Because scientifically what they would say is every point in space has its own unique time. But you are a manifestation, a point in space. Now why he kind of linked space and time together was before in Newtonian physics as well, they thought of space as something that exists whether there's things present in it or not. And basically they've come to understand that the only thing that gives substance to space is the relationship between objects. If there's no relationship between objects, there's no space. And so space, in a sense, is just a configuration of relationships. The reason we can figure out what this space looks like is because there's stuff in it. And there's walls, and they're all related, and that gives us perspective, understanding. So space is relational. And so to a large extent, what I've been able to take away from Einstein's understanding of space-time is both space and time is simply a configuration of relationships. Now, what I want to introduce now, and I don't claim that Einstein did this, I'm just taking it further because I can give you a recommendation of books. There's a book called The Order of Time. It's by an Italian professor that I think won the Nobel Prize for his work. Very good and very understandable on a normal level. But what I love about what these guys say, and also this is a book that's going to come out soon by John Hort called God After Einstein. He's got the book out already, Resting on the Future. Beautiful, can highly recommend it. But in our changing our understanding of time and eternity, if time is something that really exists, and time is as unique to me as my presence is, then we can also look at saying, instead of this block vision of time, where theoretically the future exists already, maybe the future is truly open. Maybe the future is truly possible and not determined. Maybe that is part of what Jesus spoke about God when he said, this is the God for whom all things are possible. If something's certain, it's not possible. If something's possible, it's not certain. And so if things are certain for God, if he stood outside of time and was able to see everything with absolute certainty, then with this God, nothing is possible. For all things are certain. But if the very nature of time is not this theoretical box time, but actually a real relationship, then our definition of eternity needs to change as well. For if time is relationship, what do we mean by outside of time? Do we mean that we out of all relationships? That we have no relationships? Now I understand I've had experiences in which psychological time works different as well from the conscious to the unconscious. I've had experiences where I've, subconsciously or unconsciously, I was taken back to a moment in my past, which if I had to try and recall it with my natural ability, I couldn't remember the details, the feelings, the experiences. I vaguely remembered what happened. But your unconscious experiences and retains and recalls experiences differently. And I've been taken back in a moment where it was like 30 years ago, where suddenly I experienced the emotion, the feeling, everything exactly as it happened in that moment. It's normally a traumatic experience. So traumatic we often associate with something bad, like a death or so, but it could be traumatic to fall in love as well. You know, it's something that's traumatic just means it's overwhelming. It's something that you didn't have the words for. It didn't fit within your structure of interpretation. So I've been back in moments where I was there and it seemed like time was suspended. And I was suddenly back in that moment. So psychologically, we can experience time differently. And I think that's mostly what people mean when they say outside of time. But if we want to be more accurate, and if time is relationship, then I never want to be outside of time.
That's right.
And the Hebrew writers, when they spoke about God's eternity, they did not work within the philosophical categories of Plato.
That's right.
For them, God's eternity was not him being outside of time. Rather, God's eternity was God's faithfulness throughout time. It was the very fact that time could not exhaust God that was his eternity. But God is in this time, in this world with us. And despite whatever happens, he is faithful. He is faithful. He is faithful. He is faithful. Time will not exhaust him. And in that sense, when they say God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, they did not mean he is that omniboring God for whom everything's already settled, but rather the kind of God that never gives up on his promises to you, the kind of God that never leaves you nor forsakes you, who's made a commitment in his love to you that's irreversible. And to a large extent, we can see that reflected in our love for our partners and one another. We have changed enormously since we first met, 29 years ago. Yet at the same time, love is not just a commitment to I like what you are now. Love is that commitment of I'm going to desire you and like you forever, whatever you become.
Oh, yeah.
You know? And even as we look back, I can see all the changes that has taken place in me, that has taken place in Mary Ann, yet I can also say there's something beautifully reliable and constant and faithful in our relationship. But that kind of insight to say, you've been faithful is not the same as saying, you've been absolutely boringly changeless for the last 10 years. I love the fact that we can be in a dynamic relationship filled with change and surprises, and yet there's something beautifully constant about the love we have for one another. And even love itself is not something static. Love is a movement. And one of the why I want to stay in love is because I've never found its bottom. I've never fully comprehended it. I've never fully captured it. One of the things that keeps us in love is the understanding that there's a depth to me, there's a depth to her, that despite everything I know of her, and I don't think anyone knows her better than I do, but despite all of that, I can still be mesmerized by the fact that there's a depth to her that is way beyond what I know. This is the same as our relationship with God. When we think we've defined Him and boxed Him in, what a boring, predictable God we have. A God of our own making. And once we start realizing that God is always inviting us and seducing us into experiencing Him beyond our concepts and boxes that we've placed Him in, then I begin to realize that Christ in you, Christ in me, means that there's a depth to me which is inexhaustible. Hey, if you're bored with yourself, it's because you don't see what God sees. God's excited about your life because He can see beauty and meaning and unfolding that you haven't seen it. And that is what excites Him about you, and why He continually stands before you and says, wow, do you know what beauty, what meaning is possible for you? So, if time is not a box out of which God can step into His timeless eternity, but rather time is the very dynamic relationships and configuration of His relationships. And I think time just gives more focus on how these relationships change than space. But in a sense, they speak about the same thing, is how things are related. And time basically just tells us this relationship is moving. It's changing. So if time is relational, then what is eternity? If it's not the opposite of time, maybe eternity is finding the meaning and the beauty of the temporal. Maybe eternity is allowing our eyes to be opened to realize that even the simplest moment of exchanging a smile or having a coffee with a friend or giving your child a hug has got value and meaning way beyond the second and the temporal moment in which it was experienced. About a year ago, I was present when my dad passed away. They called us to the hospital that morning. He was only in for a couple of days because he had some heart palpitations. And we went in, and he was very weak. And I went in determined that he's coming home today. You know, I've had enough of his hospital and their nonsense. If it was his time, at least I wanted him to spend it with his family for the last few days. So we went in. My mom came a little bit later, and my dad could hardly speak at this moment. And I said, Dad, we're here today. We're taking you home. And he didn't respond. And my mom spoke as well. She said, don't you want to come back with me, come home, etc.? And then I said, well, it's your choice. I just kind of sensed in that moment, it's your choice. We can take you back, or we can say goodbye now, and you can just go and be with your son. My brother passed away when I was young. And go and be with the Lord. And we said, do you want to go back home with Mom? And he shook his head. And he said, do you want to go and be with the Lord? Yes. And Miriam sang a beautiful song. My mom prayed with him. He reached over and just held my hand. And from the moment that he said, yes, I want to go, it was a few seconds, and he breathed out his last breath. Wow. And he was gone. And it's a precious moment, but very touching. But in the days that followed, of course, you are deeply affected by an event like that. And the temporality of human existence became so visible to me, not because of its futility, but because of its preciousness. Very often it is limits that makes things more valuable. Now, if we did not know that we only have a certain amount of time, we probably wouldn't have bothered thinking about time at all, or asking any questions about the meaning of time, because who cares? I've got all the time in the world. But it's the very fact that there is a limit to your time that raises the questions of what does it mean and what is its value. Now, a few years ago we went up to Breckenridge and we had a day there with our kids, and to my surprise they wanted to sell us oxygen. And I thought, I've never paid for oxygen in my life, I just breathe. But because it was in a smaller supply up there, there was less oxygen, they now had the ability to make money of something that was available in limited supply. So limits often makes the value of something more evident and brings it out. It was a couple of weeks after my dad passed away that we walked into our hometown, and there was a homeless man that we've encountered a few times and given him food or whatever he needed, but he's an old homeless guy, and every time I see him I'm surprised that he made it through another night. You know? And he walked up to me, and suddenly in that moment I just recognized my dad in him. The preciousness of that frailty in a person that was in the natural completely different from my dad, you know, a totally different life and story, but suddenly the beauty and the preciousness of that frailty of old age was suddenly visible, and I just saw my dad in this man. I was overwhelmed, just wanted to bless him, but for me that was a little bit of an insight in how we can start recognizing eternity in time. There's a beauty and a meaning and a value to every moment that transcends the moment. And I think the gospel brings us to a place where we can recognize that value and that beauty. And it was Meister Eckhart that actually spoke about detachment. And many people think of it in a negative way. They think detachment is, I'm not going to allow myself to feel or to experience this moment fully. But what Meister Eckhart meant, I believe, is exactly that experience that I had with my dad and with that old beggar, that I could detach the beauty and the value of that encounter and recognize it not only in my dad in that moment, but recognize that same beauty and preciousness in another man at another time. That's detachment. And it means that when we encounter one another, I become aware that there's a depth and a beauty and a value to this encounter that transcends you and me. That however precious this moment is, I'm not going to become attached to you personally for this value and this beauty. I can recognize it in another as well. Can you see how that both brings a joyful expectation into every encounter, and also a freedom to not expect that meaning to only come from one person or one encounter, that I can expect it in so many different places. What a mystery we are part of. that in each one of us, God is waiting to be recognized, to be encountered, to be experienced. In each one of us, there's a part of God who wants to reconnect with himself in you. That's why our fellowship is so precious. This is parts of God coming together and recognizing themselves. Let us create man, our image, our likeness. Jesus says you should love your neighbor as yourself. We've kind of reinterpreted that and said, okay, you've got to first learn how to love yourself and then you can love your neighbor. Or you must love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. That's not what Jesus said. He said you must love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, your definition of self needs to change.
Wow.
That self is not just this little ego contained within this body, but there's a part of myself in you. Waiting to be recognized, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be loved, not as something alien. Love your neighbor as yourself. Colossians 1. In him all things consists. Whether things seen or unseen. Whether principalities or powers, all things exists through him, for him, by him. This word that was in the beginning, that was with God, that was God, and this word through whom all things came into existence, and nothing exists except through him. And verse 10 says, this word has always been in the world, but we did not recognize it. And then in verse 14 it says, this word became flesh.
Yes.
Jesus comes to unveil the inner logic of creation. And the inner logic of creation is that all creation is incarnation. All of creation is God unfolding into material form. And we often quote verse 14 thinking that we're just speaking about Jesus. You know, the word became flesh and we think about Jesus. But that verse starts with the word and. That means there's something before it that we need to read to complete this thought. And the verse before it doesn't speak about Jesus, it actually speaks about you. It says you were born, not of the will of man nor of the will of flesh, but of God. And the thoughts of God became flesh and dwelt in us. Of his fullness have we all received grace upon grace upon grace. In other words, if you can in this moment see what makes you you, what really makes you you, you will see nothing less than the infinite generosity of God pouring himself out into your existence. Creation is not something that happened a long time ago. It is happening. Moment by moment by moment, God desires you into existence. Your very existence is proof that he likes you. Ephesians 1 verse 4 speaks about the God who before the very foundation of this world, before you had any opportunity to impress him or to disappoint him.
Yeah.
He thought of you. He named you, and the thought of you was so overwhelmingly beautiful to God that he decided, I've got to put some flesh onto this thought. I've got to embody this thought. And the thoughts of God became flesh. This is what it looks like when God thinks. You are his idea, his desire. And his invitation remains for you, not to remain inferior observers from a distance, vaguely adoring a distant God, but his desire has always been to have creatures that would be nothing less than his own image and likeness. Creatures who has the ability to surprise him. Creatures who has the ability to disappoint him. Because that's what love does. It gives the freedom for you to make your own decisions. But creatures whom he will never, ever, ever leave alone or abandon. He's at home in your story, hovering over your chaos, continuing to create new possibilities and opportunities for you to love. So, and when you love, that is when God is truly himself in you. So many people who have had near-death experiences, and Marianne also had one, and most of them can testify that in some form or another, everything that is temporal, and basically what they mean by that is everything that is not love seems to dissolve. Many of these people will testify of having re-experienced their whole lives, maybe in a flash, and the only thing that remained was the moments in which they loved and in which they learned. Oh. So, this God, who is not standing outside of our philosophical box time, but rather this God who is the very movement of relationship. He is the very energy source to time and space. He is the very, and that's maybe what we try to say with the terminology Trinity, is that there's a dynamic relational movement that is God. And it's this very God that enables all of creation that's so much part of this fleshly now world. And yes, there's room for plans, but it seems like this God is much more interested in demonstrating his love to you by extending extravagant freedom and inviting you to co-create your story. He's much more interested in that than controlling the narrative. He knows where he wants to take us, just like all of us know that we want our children to be well-adjusted kids who can handle the difficulties that life faces, etc. We've got desires and goals and intentions for them, but we do not manipulate their every hour or day, or if you do, your relationship's probably not very good with them. Because love does not control. It just doesn't. So what's one of the other implications? Well, one of the other implications of this view of time and eternity is that the future is truly open rather than determined. Now that often raises all kinds of other theological questions. Doesn't the Bible say that he knows the end from the beginning? And we add a lot of interpretation to that. For instance, we just add automatically and everything in between, which is not what it said. He kind of said he knows where he wants to go from the very beginning, but how we get there, he says, you tell this story. I'm going to seduce you, I'm going to influence you, I'm going to draw you to that goal of union and love, but you tell the story. And your decisions really matter. It brings up other questions as well. For instance, God's omniscience. It reminds me of another book, Omnipresence and Other Theological Mistakes. But that's another book. We'll stay with this one. Omniscience. God knows all things. So very often we've interpreted that, but doesn't that mean that the future is determined because God knows all things? That's a valid question. Well, I maintain that God is omniscient in terms of he knows everything that can be known. And part of what he knows is that some things are indeterminate. God knows that some things are possible, not certain. So he knows everything that can be known, but that doesn't mean that the future is determined. It simply means that surely he foresees, and if he is present not just in me but in all of us, then his understanding and insight into our world far exceeds what I can imagine. Yet with all that knowledge, he is still the God of possibility and not certainty. The God that gives us the freedom to co-create with him. So that's a little bit of a different perspective on time. And all I wanted to say about time is real, time is relational. It's the configuration of relationships. Eternity is finding the value and the beauty within the temporal. It's not the opposite of time. This is what's so shockingly different about the incarnation. A God who is able to come and live in our space, in our time, in our bodies. That was offensive to most religions of the day, and still is even to Christianity if we think of the implications of this God who is at home in your life, whose whole purpose was not to someday rescue you and take you to heaven, but in John, I think it's 14, he speaks about, no, it's further on, 15 or 16. He says, in that day, you will know that I'm in the Father is in me, I'm in you. And further down that chapter, he says, and the Father and I will come, and we will make our home in you. It started, this is chapter 14, it starts off with, in my Father's house are many mansions, and I go to prepare a place. And that's the verse that we build our hope on. Jesus, come and save us from the scrap in this world. We want to go to the Father's mansion. But he uses that same word that we translated mansion. He says, in that day, my Father and I will come, and we will make our mansion in you. And so while we're dreaming about being whipped away to another dimension, God has always dreamed about living in you. Living in your story. living in your life. Now, I don't discount the fact that there's wonders to come that I don't even imagine. That's all great, but it seems like God's more obsessed with your life right here, right now, than what we are often about. In chapter 17 he says, this is eternal life, that you know the Father and the Son. Eternal life, he doesn't define it in terms of duration or in terms of location, he defines it in terms of relationship.
That's right.
That you know the Father and the Son. Oh, Papa, may you open our eyes to the beauty, the eternity, the value that is present in this moment. Woo! Lord, may we see what you see. May we see the treasure, the pearl of great value that you've seen in this field. May we see the beauty and the meaning that you want to draw forth from this chaos. Thank you, Papa. Thank you, Appa.